Welcome to our ICMA web presentation on our recently released publication, High-Level Definitions for Sustainable Finance. My name is Nicholas Pfaff. I'm a Managing Director at ICMA, Head of Sustainable Finance, and also a member of the European Commission's Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. I am here with Simon Untermark, who is a director in our team, and with Özgür Altun, who is an associate working with us also in sustainable finance. For the purpose of this publication, I'd also like to credit Berit Lindholt-Lauritsen, Senior Climate Finance Specialist at IFC, who worked with us on secondment at ICMA, and of course, especially on these definitions. Our objective with this publication was to address the possible confusion and fragmentation on terminology in sustainable finance. We have noted in our work that terms such as climate finance, green finance, and sustainable finance have been used interchangeably. We think it's important to underline that these terms are different, that climate finance is not the same thing as green finance, which is a wider concept, and green finance is also not the same thing as sustainable finance, an even wider concept. We think this is important for use in the market, and particularly with respect to transactions in the green, social, and sustainability bond universe, but it's also very important when we come to policy. Having a policy for climate finance is not the same thing as having a policy for green finance. So our ambition with this paper is to bring clarity to the market as much as possible, but also to help disentangle terminology in the policy and regulatory world. I'm going to now turn to Özgür and ask him to comment on how we came to our definitions and the research and the references we have made.
Many thanks, Nicholas. Yes, in the build-up to the proposed terminology, we conducted some extensive background research looking at whether authoritative public bodies or public-private initiatives in the sustainable finance field took any position on the terms we are aiming to define. This includes terminology proposed by the United Nations related initiatives, such as the UNPRI and UNEP, and also language derived from the EU Sustainable Finance Agenda, as well as the terminology used by China and the G20. In our proposed definitions, we also take into account current market usage and terminology from the green, social, and sustainability bond markets. And in this respect, we benefited greatly from the expertise of the GBP-SPP Executive Committee. We also received very valuable input from the ICMA Sustainable Finance Committee, which has been set up in late 2019, and that brings together various ICMA constituencies to focus on regulatory matters related to sustainable finance. Readers of the document can find this useful mapping exercise under the Annex 2 of the paper for further details.
Özgür, many thanks for that. I would like to now come to the diagram, which those of you who are looking at us on screen should be able to see, and then I will try to describe as clearly as possible for those of you who are listening to us on a podcast. So this diagram attempts to illustrate the different definitions and the key themes embedded in these definitions, as well as dynamic concepts. I'm going to start with climate finance, which is at the center of this diagram. The key themes, unsurprisingly, are climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And the dynamic concept is climate transition, which is illustrated with a double-sided arrow. And as a reminder, climate transition in our definition is directly related to the Paris Agreement. The wider concept is green finance. To get to green finance, you add themes such as pollution prevention and control, natural resource conservation, biodiversity conservation, and other environmental objectives. Next to green finance, we have social finance, where the themes are, again, unsurprising issues, outcomes. All of this is embedded in ESG investing, where the differentiating theme is governance. Under green finance, social finance, and climate finance, we have another double-sided arrow, which refers to the concept of impact finance. Now, our widest definition is sustainable finance, which encompasses all of the previous definitions, but also adds a differentiating theme, which is economic and financial stability. So I hope that you will find this diagram useful. We spent a fair amount of time putting it together and would be very happy for listeners to refer to it. Now, I'd like to turn back to Simon and come to this point of ESG. This is a term which has been in use for the market for a long time, but it is being used more and more frequently. And I would like to ask you, Simon, for background on this concept and also perhaps the more current uses.
Yes, Nicholas. This concept has actually been in the market for quite some years. So in a way, you could say market participants have been familiar with it. So why is ICMA looking to define that again? And that is correct. But we've also seen an evolution in ESG investing. And to explain this, historically responsible or ESG investing mainly consisted of negative screening on ethical grounds. That means end investors or asset managers on their behalf actively chose to not invest in certain companies or whole industries such as tobacco, weapons, and so on, or even excluded countries like South Africa under apartheid, for example. In recent years, then, investors as well as corporates began to realize that environmental, social, and governance issues actually have an effect on a company's financial performance, which can be both positive or negative, depending on how the market interprets the data. And then lately, there's growing interest from other stakeholders as well, such as retail investors, employees, clients, and others that want to know more about the ESG-related non-financial aspects of a company. I think it's also interesting that historically, most of the focus has been on governance, which is still very important, of course, but especially since the Paris Agreement in 2015, environmental factors have become top of the agenda, and also social is getting more attention, particularly with the coronavirus pandemic having put a spotlight on social issues lately. And most importantly, though, with the EU's action plan on financing sustainable growth, which has been published in 2018, ESG has also made it onto the European legislative agenda in order to strengthen financial stability. We particularly noticed that when looking at various regulations for our disclosure memo, which we published recently. Isn't that right, Özgür?
Indeed, Simon, thank you. In fact, regulations resulting from the EU action plan, such as the disclosure regulation, the low carbon benchmark regulation, and the taxonomy regulation, as well as the recent consultations on NFRD and the renewed sustainable finance strategy, are all, in one way or another, focusing on the concept of ESG. To give listeners a more detailed example, under the disclosure regulation, ESG is used in a manner that is broadly consistent with our proposed definition. However, and coming back to our focus on consistency, the regulation also uses ESG somewhat interchangeably with the concept of sustainability factors that is defined with reference to environmental, social, and employee matters, respect for human rights, anti-corruption, and anti-bribery matters. So this is an example of potential and unintentional blurring of terminology between ESG and sustainability.
Many thanks, Özgür. Simon, turning back to you, can we come back to social finance, and can you explain how we define it, and also why it has become more topical in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting crisis?
Absolutely. So like ESG investing and green finance that we talked about earlier, we see social finance as part of sustainable finance. And in the paper, we define social finance as financing that supports actions mitigating or addressing a specific social issue and or seeking to achieve positive social outcomes, especially but not exclusively for a target population. This is actually a definition which directly aligns with the social bond principles. And the SBP, as we call them, have been around since 2017. But we have indeed gained more traction in the last few months due to an increase in issuance of COVID-19 themed social bonds that are aligned with the principles. In the last few weeks, like we've seen with green bonds in the past, we have seen MDBs being the pioneers in this area, but there have also been some corporates and financial institutions that have come to market with social bonds aimed at dealing with the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. Now, for listeners interested in issuing bonds aligned with the SBP or SBG, the Sustainability Bond Guidelines, I would also like to mention that the GBP-SBP Executive Committee, supported by ICMA, has also underlined the relevance of social bonds in addressing the COVID-19 crisis and provided relevant guidance. And you can find the related public statement made in March, as well as additional advice for issuers in the form of new Q&A and case studies on the ICMA website.
Simon, many thanks for that. Thank you, Özgür. We're now going to bring this ICMA web presentation to a close. I'd like to thank also our listeners and to wish you all to stay safe in these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.